On USS Tang, SS-306. On the night of October 24, 1944, USS Tang was moving through the dark waters of the Formosa Strait, hunting what was left of a Japanese convoy after Commander Richard O'Kane had already sunk several ships that night, leaving the submarine down to its last 2 torpedoes. Around 2:30 in the morning, Tang lined up a shot on a crippled tanker where the first torpedo behaved exactly as expected and headed straight for the target. But the second one suddenly broke the surface, swung around in a tight arc, and started coming back toward Tang. O'Kane saw the white line of its wake turning in their direction and immediately ordered emergency power, but there were only seconds left before impact. The Mark 18 torpedo slammed into Tang's aft torpedo room, where its 570-pound warhead detonated almost directly under the men who had just loaded it, tearing away the stern, blowing out lights across the boat, and sending seawater crashing through the rear compartments as the submarine pitched down by the stern and began sliding toward the seabed in about 180 feet of water. Some of the forward compartments stayed intact for a short time, and around 30 men survived the first blast, finding themselves in twisted, dark spaces that were slowly filling with water and thick smoke. 13 of them gathered in the forward torpedo room and put on Momsen lungs, the primitive escape devices designed for exactly this kind of situation, and one after another, they crowded into the escape trunk, flooded it, and pushed out into the cold black water above. Only 9 of those men made it all the way to the surface alive, and when they finally broke through the waves, they were surrounded by oil, wreckage, and darkness, before being picked up not by friendly ships, but by the same Japanese destroyers whose convoy Tang had been attacking. Those 9 spent the rest of the war as prisoners, while the other 78 men of Tang's crew never returned, killed not by an enemy weapon, but by their own torpedo that turned back on them. 2 AHS Centaur. On May 14, 1943, the Australian hospital ship Centaur was on her way from Sydney to Port Moresby with a mission to carry medical staff and supplies north and bring wounded men back from the New Guinea front, painted bright white with huge red crosses along her sides, and fully lit at night exactly as international law required to mark a hospital ship. At about 4:10 in the morning, the Japanese submarine I-177 spotted Centaur while running at periscope depth, where what the submarine's crew saw through the lens was a slow, lightly built ship with obvious medical markings, carrying doctors, nurses, and patients rather than guns or ammunition. Yet her commander, Hajime Nakagawa, chose to attack anyway. 5 minutes later, a torpedo left the submarine and struck near the fuel tanks, where the result was immediate and violent, as fire shot up from the side of the ship, and Centaur rolled sharply to port with lights failing. People being thrown from their bunks, and passageways filling with smoke and confusion, as the crew and medical staff had almost no time to react. In roughly 3 minutes, the ship rolled over and slid beneath the surface, sinking in about 550 meters of water. Out of the 332 people on board, only 64 survived, with all 12 nurses who had sailed with Centaur dying in the sinking, as survivors ended up clinging to wreckage, and a few rafts, drifting in the open ocean under the sun by day and the cold sky by night for around 36 hours before the American destroyer USS Mugford finally found them and pulled them aboard, badly burned, dehydrated, and exhausted. The attack on Centaur was a clear violation of the Hague Convention, which protected hospital ships, and the Australian and British governments protested strongly after the war. But Nakagawa was never put on trial specifically for this sinking. About a year later, his submarine I-177 was itself destroyed with all hands, which for some felt like rough justice, though for the families of the 268 dead, it did not undo what had happened. 3. USS Wahoo, SS-238, Commander Dudley Mush Morton. At the end of 1942 in Brisbane, Australia, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton took over as captain of the submarine USS Wahoo, which up to that point had finished 2 war patrols without much to show for it. And before heading out again, Morton gathered his crew and told them bluntly that Wahoo was expendable, that they would take every reasonable precaution, but their real purpose was to sink enemy ships. From January to October 1943, Morton turned Wahoo into one of the most feared submarines in the Pacific by changing how attacks were carried out, often letting his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, handle the periscope while he stepped back to picture the whole battle in his mind. taking Wahoo into places other captains avoided, including enemy harbors, where he became the first American submarine skipper to sink a ship inside one, and taking so-called down-the-throat shots by firing torpedoes directly at oncoming destroyers instead of turning away. On one patrol in the Yellow Sea, Wahoo sank 8 ships in just 25 days, and Morton pushed his boat hard by pursuing convoys for hours, even under heavy gunfire from escort ships, before later taking Wahoo into the Sea of Japan, a shallow and dangerous area where many submarine commanders refused to go. By the time Wahoo sailed on her 7th patrol, Morton and his crew had sent 19 enemy ships totaling roughly 55,000 tons to the bottom, and he had earned 4 Navy crosses for his actions. On October 11, 1943, Wahoo was trying to pass through La Perouse Strait when Japanese patrol aircraft spotted a submarine there and dropped depth charges over its last known position, after which Wahoo simply disappeared with all 80 men on board, including Morton. News of Wahoo's loss hit the American submarine force hard, since Morton was regarded as one of the most successful and aggressive skippers of the war, and his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, later went on to command USS Tang and eventually surpassed his mentor's record, but always credited Morton with teaching him how to fight. 4. USS Argonaut, SS-166. On January 10, 1943, USS Argonaut was on her 3rd war patrol near Rabaul, in an area thick with Japanese ships and escorts, and when Argonaut made contact with a Japanese convoy, her crew prepared for an attack, launching torpedoes and managing to hit and damage at least one of the escorting destroyers, which immediately brought the others down upon them. The remaining Japanese destroyers quickly moved in and began dropping depth charges in patterns over the spot where Argonaut had been detected, turning the sea above the submarine into a violent exploding barrier. As charge after charge went off, while inside the boat, the crew would have felt the hull shudder and flex under each blast until at some point, critical systems or parts of the pressure hull gave way. A short time later, Argonaut's bow suddenly broke the surface at an odd angle, a clear sign that she was no longer able to remain submerged and had been forced up by the damage she had taken, now lying helpless and exposed to enemy guns. The Japanese destroyers surrounded the crippled submarine and opened fire at close range, with shells smashing into Argonaut's hull again and again, leaving no realistic chance to organize an orderly abandonment and no possibility of surrendering under that kind of fire. After taking repeated hits, Argonaut rolled and slipped beneath the waves for the final time. A reconnaissance aircraft observed the attack from the air, but could do nothing to help, as all 102 officers and men on Argonaut were lost with the boat, a single sinking that remains the largest loss of life on any American submarine during wartime. 5 U-352. On May 9, 1942, during a period when German U-boats were operating aggressively along the American East Coast in what submariners later called the Second Happy Time, the submarine U-352 was patrolling off North Carolina when she came across the American patrol vessel USS Icarus and moved in to attack what appeared to be a relatively soft target. The attack did not work as planned, since the torpedo failed to achieve its intended result, and Icarus detected the submarine, responding with a counterattack using depth charges that were rolled off the stern and set to explode at different depths, shaking the boat violently as equipment tore loose from mounts, gauges shattered, and some crewmen were killed or badly wounded, while vital systems took serious damage. Commander Helmut Rathke understood that staying down would lead to the loss of the entire crew, so he ordered his men to put on life jackets and then blew the ballast tanks to bring U-352 to the surface, even though he knew that surfacing under the guns of an alerted enemy ship was extremely dangerous. And when the submarine broke through the waves, it was already in bad shape, with the order given to abandon ship. Sailors began scrambling out of the hatches, many of them injured or stunned from the depth charge blasts, jumping or falling into the cold Atlantic water, where some were too badly hurt to make it out in time, while others were pulled down as the sinking submarine dragged water and debris with it. USS Icarus recovered 33 survivors from the water who spent the rest of the war as prisoners in the United States, while 15 others from U-352's crew died either in the depth charge attack or while trying to escape the sinking boat, marking the end of their war at sea. 6. U-boats crushed by pressure. On June 22, 1943, out in the middle of the Atlantic, the German submarine U-606 was stalking an Allied convoy when the Polish destroyer Berza detected her on sonar and moved into position to begin a focused depth charge attack, dropping pattern after pattern of explosives into the ocean where the U-boat had last been located, with each pattern designed to box the submarine in and deny it a path to safety. Inside U-606, the crew could hear the charges getting closer, with each blast louder and more violent than the last. So to escape the barrage, the captain ordered the boat to go deeper past the depths they normally used in combat, sinking to 500 feet, then 600, then 700 as the depth gauge climbed past the submarine's official test depth of 750 feet, the point beyond which the designers could no longer guarantee the hull would hold. At about 780 feet, the ocean started to show the crew just how unforgiving it could be as the pressure hull began to groan and strain while rivets started to give way and shot across the compartments like bits of shrapnel. Light bulbs shattered, plunging parts of the boat into sudden darkness. Pressure gauges broke under the strain, and pipes and fittings that had always been reliable began to leak and then spray water under high pressure into the interior. The crew stood in weak emergency lighting or near total darkness, listening to the submarine itself complain and deform under the crushing weight of the water outside, where every new crack, snap, or moan from the hull brought the same thought to mind, that the next second might be their last, while water began to collect at their feet as more leaks opened up. Despite all of this, U-606's hull managed to hold together long enough for the captain to maneuver away from the worst of the attack and eventually bring the boat back up to safer depths and later to the surface far from the escort that had been trying to destroy them, though many other submarines throughout the Battle of the Atlantic were not as fortunate, with hundreds of German submariners dying when their boats were forced below safe depth and either collapsed suddenly in violent implosions or failed more slowly as water rushed in while men tried desperately to fight the flooding.